A white woman calls the police on a black teenager walking through her neighborhood. But moments later, her confidence shatters when the boy's mother arrives, someone far more powerful than she ever imagined. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Hawthorne Ridge, an affluent gated community just outside Columbus, Ohio. The sidewalks were spotless, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. Elijah Carter, 16, adjusted the strap of his backpack and wiped sweat from his forehead. Dressed in gym shorts and a hoodie, he had just finished basketball practice and was cutting through the neighborhood on his usual route home. From the porch of a pristine white brick colonial, Margaret Whitmore narrowed her eyes. Her manicured fingers tensed around the stem of her wineglass as she tracked the boy's movements. Who is he? The uneasy whisper in her mind quickly turned into something sharper. She had never seen him before, and in a place like this, that meant trouble. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Setting her glass down, she reached for her phone. 911. Yes, I need to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood. A young black male wandering around? No, he's not familiar. I don't know if he belongs here. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Margaret's face as she exhaled slowly. Down the street, the distant wail of sirens broke the peaceful hum of suburbia. A police SUV rounded the corner at high speed, its flashing lights slicing through the dusk, racing toward Elijah, who had no idea his ordinary walk home was about to spiral into something far worse. 16-year-old Elijah Carter walked at an easy pace, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The cool evening air brushed against his skin as he strolled through Hawthorne Ridge, the exclusive gated community he had passed through countless times before. His sneakers made soft scuffs against the pavement, a rhythmic sound that blended with the distant hum of sprinklers watering immaculate front lawns. Dressed in basketball shorts and a hoodie, he still carried the lingering sweat of practice, eager to get home and unwind. From the porch of a stately colonial home, Margaret Whitmore narrowed her eyes. She had spent the last 15 years ensuring that Hawthorne Ridge remained a certain kind of neighborhood, quiet, pristine, predictable. And she had never seen his kind walking these streets alone. Her manicured fingers tapped against the stem of her wineglass as she watched the boy move. Dressed like that? Wandering around? He's either up to something or about to be. Her grip tightened. People move into places like this to escape trouble, not invited in. Disapproval curdled into suspicion. She set her glass down and reached for her phone. 911. Yes, I need to report a suspicious individual. A young black male loitering in the neighborhood. No, I don't recognize him. He looks out of place, possibly casing houses. As she spoke, the camera lingers on Elijah, oblivious, relaxed, completely unaware that his peaceful walk home is being twisted into something dangerous. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the quiet of Hawthorne Ridge, bouncing off the towering homes and echoing through the tree-lined streets. Blue and red lights flickered against the pristine white facades as a black and white police SUV screeched to a stop, tires skidding slightly against the pavement. Elijah Carter froze mid-step. His heart pounded in his chest as the harsh glare of headlights swallowed him whole, blinding him for a split second. The neighborhood was still. Even the crickets had gone silent. From across the street, Margaret Whitmore stood on her porch, arms crossed, face tight, with restrained satisfaction. She had done her part. Now, it was in the officer's hands. The SUV doors flew open, and Officers Bennett and Rodriguez emerged, their movements brisk and assertive. Bennett, a stocky, hard-eyed officer in his 40s, had a hand resting dangerously close to his holstered firearm. His partner, Rodriguez, slightly younger, trailed a step behind, face unreadable. "Hands where we can see them," Bennett barked. Elijah's breath caught. His arms instinctively lifted, palms out, fingers spread wide. "Stay calm," Stay still. No sudden moves. The warnings his mother had drilled into him since childhood rang in his head. "Sir, officers, what's going on?" he asked, his voice measured but tight. "You live around here?" Bennett cut in, ignoring the question. His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. Elijah blinked, confusion washing over him. "Live here?" It was a question with an obvious answer. His house was only a few blocks away. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "I live on Greenbrier. I was just heading home." Bennett's lip curled slightly. Greenbrier was inside Hawthorne Ridge. The fact that this kid claimed to live there seemed to irritate him. "That's so?" Bennett's gaze flickered over Elijah's clothes. The hoodie, the basketball shorts, the well-worn sneakers. "Doesn't seem like the kind of place for someone like you." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. "I live here," he repeated. "You can check my ID." "We'll get to that," Bennett said, stepping closer. Rodriguez glanced at his partner, but said nothing. Margaret, still watching from the porch, clutched her chest dramatically, as if relieved that the officers had arrived just in time. "I called them," she suddenly interjected, her voice carrying across the lawn. Both officers turned. "I saw him wandering," Margaret continued, shaking her head. "He looked lost, or something else." Elijah exhaled sharply. "Something else," he repeated, his jaw tightening. "Enough talking," Bennett snapped. "You got any weapons on you?" "What? No, I—" "Turn around," Bennett ordered. Elijah hesitated, his pulse hammering. "For what?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "For our safety," Bennett said flatly. "And yours." The words twisted like a blade. Safety. For who? Elijah gritted his teeth but obeyed. He turned slowly, his hands still raised. Bennett reached forward, patting down the pockets of his hoodie and gym shorts, roughly pushing and pulling at the fabric. "Nothing," he muttered, stepping back. His eyes fell on Elijah's backpack. "Open it." Elijah's stomach dropped. He hesitated for the first time, gripping the strap instinctively. "Why?" "Because I said so," Bennett shot back, his voice razor-sharp. Elijah's fingers clenched around the zipper. His school books, a granola bar, a half-empty water bottle, nothing dangerous, were inside. But it didn't matter. They weren't searching for something. They were searching for anything. Margaret shifted on her porch, her lips curling in satisfaction, as if she had just uncovered some long-hidden truth. Elijah took a slow breath and reached for the zipper, fully aware that, in this moment, even the most innocent movement could be misinterpreted. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, a powerful voice rang out from the distance. "Elijah!" The officer stiffened. Margaret flinched. Elijah turned his head toward the familiar sound, and in the distance, a sleek black SUV came to an abrupt stop. The car door swung open. His mother had arrived. The low hum of an engine broke through the thick tension hanging in the air. A sleek black SUV approached at a steady but deliberate speed, its tinted windows concealing the occupant inside. Just as it reached the flashing police lights, the vehicle jerked to a sharp stop, its tires skidding slightly against the pavement. Elijah's head snapped toward the sound. He knew that car. The driver's side door flew open, and Denise Brooks stepped out, exuding authority with every movement. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit, her sharp heels clicked against the pavement as she strode forward. The air seemed to shift around her, the tension thickening as the officers instinctively straightened. A murmur spread among the small crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather. "Wait. Is that—" Officer Rodriguez took a slight step back. He recognized her immediately. The Truong Columbus. Officer Bennett, however, had no clue who he was dealing with. "Ma'am, I need you to stand back," Bennett said, his voice firm but lacking its earlier confidence. Denise didn't stop. She walked directly toward her son. Her gaze locked onto him first, scanning him from head to toe. "Elijah, are you hurt?" she asked, her voice even but unmistakably sharp. Elijah exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. "No, Mom," he said quickly. "I'm fine." Her eyes flicked toward the officers and suddenly, the air felt noticeably colder. "Fine?" she repeated, her tone controlled but dangerous. Bennett squared his shoulders, trying to regain control. "Ma'am, we were handling a situation," he stated, his voice less sure than before. Denise slowly turned to face him. "And what situation would that be?" she asked, her tone neutral, though everyone around could sense the weight behind the words. Bennett hesitated. "We received a report of a suspicious individual in the area," he explained. "We were conducting a routine check." Denise's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious?" she repeated. "A 16-year-old boy walking home? That's your definition of suspicious?" Bennett shifted uncomfortably. "He matched the description given by a resident," he said, his tone defensive. Denise didn't blink. "Oh," she said. "And what exactly was that description?" Bennett faltered. From her spot on the porch, Margaret Whitmore was frozen in place, her face drained of color. This wasn't what she had expected. Denise finally turned her gaze to her. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said smoothly. Margaret jolted slightly at the sound of her name. "You made the call, correct?" Denise continued. Margaret's mouth opened and closed once before she found her voice. I was just concerned," she stammered. "I didn't recognize him and that was enough to assume he was a threat?" Denise cut in, her tone still measured but her eyes sharp. Margaret swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she mumbled. Denise's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Rodriguez, still watching, was starting to regret every choice that had led him to this moment. He had realized who Denise was 30 seconds ago, and now he could practically hear the fallout coming. Bennett, on the other hand, was still trying to salvage authority he no longer had. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand that you're upset, but we were just following procedure." Denise turned back to him, cutting off his excuse with a sharp look. "You think I'm upset?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. The slight shift in her tone made Rodriguez visibly tense. "Officer," Denise continued, stepping closer, "I don't have the luxury of being upset. What I have is a son who was just treated like a suspect for existing. What I have is a police department that saw a black teenager and assumed he was up to something." Bennett couldn't meet her eyes anymore. Denise took a slow breath, exhaling through her nose before finally delivering the final blow. "I also have direct oversight of this city's police force. You do know that, don't you, Officer Bennett?" The weight of her words dropped like a hammer. Margaret let out a sharp breath. Rodriguez visibly tensed, his eyes widening slightly. Bennett finally realized exactly who he was talking to. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Denise didn't give him the chance to recover. "This is not over," she stated. For the first time that night, the authority in the situation had completely shifted. Elijah, still standing between them, watched his mother work. The fear he had felt minutes ago was gone. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into her porch, but it was too late for that. Denise finally turned back to her son. "Come on, Elijah," she said. "We're leaving." Elijah exhaled slowly and stepped toward her, the tension in his body finally starting to drain. As they walked toward the SUV, he glanced back just once. Margaret stood stiffly on her porch, arms crossed tightly. Bennett and Rodriguez remained frozen in place. Everything had changed, and none of them knew what was coming next. Denise Brooks stood firm, her gaze locked onto Officer Bennett. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in her sharp, unwavering eyes. The street was eerily silent now, all movement stilled by the weight of the moment. "So," she said, her voice controlled but laced with steel, "would you like to explain why my son was stopped?" Bennett, who had been so commanding just moments before, suddenly seemed unsure of his footing. His fingers twitched at his belt as he cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious individual," he started, glancing toward Rodriguez for backup. But his partner remained silent. Denise didn't blink. "A suspicious individual," she repeated. She let the words settle in the air before adding, "And what exactly made my son suspicious, officer?" Bennett hesitated. "Well, we were responding to a resident's concern." Denise turned sharply, cutting him off. "Which resident?" Her gaze landed on Margaret Whitmore, still standing on her porch. The woman, who had been following the exchange with nervous anticipation, suddenly found herself the center of attention. Margaret stiffened. "Mrs. Whitmore," Denise said smoothly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "You made the call, correct?" Margaret swallowed, gripping the railing beside her. I just thought something was off," she stammered. "I didn't recognize him, and he was just walking around." Denise's head tilted slightly. Walking. She let the word hang between them. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "It's not like that," she insisted, her voice thinner now. "I was just being cautious. You never know these days." "Cautious?" Denise interjected. She took a slow step forward, forcing Margaret to meet her gaze. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly about my son made you feel unsafe?" Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. The officers stood in stiff silence, watching the exchange unfold with growing unease. "Was it his height?" Denise pressed, her voice steady. "The way he was dressed? Or was it something else?" Margaret looked away. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." "From what?" Denise's tone sharpened. Margaret flinched. Elijah shifted slightly, watching as his mother dismantled the entire situation with nothing but her presence. Denise turned back to Bennett. "So let me get this straight," she said, folding her arms. "You received a call about a suspicious person, a teenage boy walking home in his own neighborhood, and instead of assessing the situation rationally, you immediately escalated it. Is that correct?" Bennett exhaled slowly, realizing there was no good way out of this. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job." "Your job?" Denise's expression hardened. Bennett, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced at Rodriguez again, but his partner still refused to speak. Denise took a deep breath, her patience wearing thin. "And tell me, officer," she continued, "if my son had been a white teenager walking down this street, would we be standing here right now?" Bennett had no answer. Rodriguez finally shifted his weight. "Ma'am, we didn't mean any harm," he said, attempting to ease the tension. Denise's eyes snapped to him. "Didn't mean any harm," she echoed. "That's the problem. You never mean harm, but somehow it keeps happening." Rodriguez looked away. Margaret let out a slow breath, her confidence completely unraveled. She had assumed this would be a simple case of police handling the situation. She hadn't expected this. Bennett, still standing rigid, attempted to salvage what little authority he had left. "We'll file a report on the incident, ma'am. And if there was a mistake..." Denise's expression darkened. "A mistake?" She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out her phone. The officers tensed. She scrolled through her contacts, then raised the phone to her ear. "Yes, it's Denise Brooks," she said into the receiver, her voice clipped. "I need to speak with Chief Wallace, now." Bennett stiffened. Rodriguez finally realized the full scope of the situation. She wasn't just some concerned mother. Denise Brooks had direct access to the chief of police. Margaret paled. "Thank you," Denise said, lowering the phone after a brief pause. She turned back to the officers, her expression unreadable. "This won't be forgotten," she said. The weight of her words settled over them like a storm cloud. Bennett said nothing. Rodriguez shifted on his feet, realizing that this night was far from over. Margaret's hands tightened around the railing, her world suddenly feeling much smaller. Elijah, standing beside his mother, finally let out a long, steady breath. He didn't need to say anything. His mother had already said it all. Denise lowered her phone slowly, her expression calm but firm. She turned back toward Officer Bennett, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Officer Bennett, would you like to explain precisely why my son was detained?" Bennett shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we received a call. A resident was concerned about someone suspicious." "Suspicious?" Denise echoed quietly. "Tell me, officer, what exactly was suspicious about my son?" Bennett hesitated, glancing nervously at Rodriguez, who stared silently at the pavement. Denise's gaze shifted to Margaret Whitmore, still frozen on her porch. "Mrs. Whitmore," she addressed clearly, "you made the call. Perhaps you can tell me exactly how Elijah threatened your safety." Margaret opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Her face flushed bright red. Denise stepped closer, her voice controlled but cutting. "Tonight, my son was treated as a suspect in his own neighborhood simply because of the color of his skin. He had me to protect him, but how many others don't?" The officers remained silent, the weight of their actions fully dawning on them. Denise placed her hand protectively on Elijah's shoulder. "Understand this clearly. Safety isn't a privilege based on appearance or address. Justice must be equal. No exceptions." Margaret shrank back slightly, eyes lowered, visibly shaken and humiliated. Denise's voice softened as she addressed the watching neighbors directly. "What if Elijah wasn't my son? What if I wasn't your mayor? Would tonight have ended differently?" A heavy silence settled over the street, neighbors exchanging uncomfortable glances as they contemplated Denise's powerful question. Denise opened the car door, guiding Elijah inside. She paused briefly, looking directly toward the gathering neighbors and officers one final time. "Ask yourselves honestly, would Elijah have been safe tonight if his mother wasn't the mayor?" She entered the vehicle, its taillights disappearing slowly into the night, leaving the neighborhood quiet, reflective, and forever changed.